Hello everyone, I'm Tarun Degania and we're going to be talking about evaluate questions within critical reasoning today. Let's get started. Now the way the session will be structured is we'll first have you solve a question. We'll have a very short discussion on it. Then I'll give you an in-depth look at the process that I use to solve it, that I would recommend that you use to solve this and other types of critical reasoning questions. Then we look at another question so you can see the process and application again. And at the very end, I'll give you a study plan that should make you better at evaluating 4 days. It should work, but of course depends on the level. And if you still face doubts, if you still face issues, just drop in a comment and well, we'll see what we can do. Let's see. So the question is now in front of you. Try it, take up to 3 minutes, let's say. Pause the video here. When you're done, be confident about your answer is all I ask for. Go for it. Well, I hope that you got the right answer, which in this particular case would be B for Bombay. Now the reason that B is the answer, in order to understand that, we have to understand the stem, which is what I call this part of the argument. Now, what the argument tells us here is that cotton was modified in some form so that it could resist some pest called bollworms, right? And it worked in the first year. But this particular year, bollworms cause extensive damage. So that's a contrast. Why did it happen? What changed? That's what we want to understand. Now, the argument says that it was not that bollworms became resistant to the insecticide. That is the most obvious explanation. The argument takes that away from us, pardon me. It then goes on to say or give us an explanation that corn is a crop that bollworms feed on. And corn was planted in record numbers, because of which I expect that bollworm population would have increased and that would have caused damage to this crop, the cotton crop. But notice that there is an assumption there. We are assuming that just because there was extra corn planted, there were more bollworms. That's not necessary. It's logical, but that's not necessary. Those are called assumptions. And what I've done so far is take out the facts, take out the conclusion, and pick the assumption in the middle. At least one, so that I can connect everything together. Yeah. Now when we look at the options, option B is saying that whether plantings of cotton that does not produce the insecticide are suffering unusually extensive damage as well. So what this tells me is, with an answer of yes to this question, right, whether plantings of cotton, the option in itself is a question. If I take the answer to be yes, then that means that bollworms are not just hurting these genetically modified cotton plants, they're also hurting normal cotton plants, which then suggests that yes, we have a lot of bollworms, right? It agrees. But if normal cotton is not being affected unusually this year, if there isn't an unusual amount of damage caused to normal cotton this year, then there must be something wrong with the genetically modified cotton. In that case, bollworms cannot be the answer. The population spike in bollworms cannot be the answer. Which tells me that if the answer to B is known, I can at least rule out one possible problem with the argument. So it does evaluate the argument. The two different answers to the option B, to the question that option B raises, to the two possible different answers to it, gives me either belief in the argument or disproves the argument to some extent. And that's what evaluation is. So B becomes our answer, right? Now the rest of them, I would not want to go through right now because the reasons would be very simplistic. They're irrelevant or blah and blue. So instead of doing that right now, where it would be tougher for us to understand, let's look at the method that can be used to get to this point where you can go through an argument quickly, where you can go through the options quickly and know exactly what you're looking for at each stage. If you do not know that, you can't really be efficient, right? So let's focus on that for now. Why the options are incorrect, if you have trouble with that, okay, drop a comment, I'll get to that as well. Now, we're going to be talking about the approach to critical reasoning as a whole. We will get to evaluate questions specifically in 5 minutes or so. But before we do that, we have to know how to approach the stem or the argument itself, right? And that's the first step of the 4-step process. The first thing you want to do is understand the argument properly. And we'll go deeper into it in 1 minute. But once you've understood it, which I showed you with the last question, Then you want to identify certain factors that could affect that argument. For example, when I spoke of the assumption that was made that bollworm population had in fact increased just because corn was higher in quantity. That wasn't proven, that wasn't stated in the text, just suggested. That's a factor, the population of bollworms. Did it spike or did it not spike? That identification helps me place the argument properly, helps me find flaws in the argument. Then we want to do the same thing with the options. Every option talks about a particular factor. It might qualify it with certain modifiers and whatnot jargon, but it will be talking about one particular factor. Spotting that instead of focusing on some other part of the option. That is the reason why most people go wrong. Even with the toughest questions or the easiest, wherever you go wrong, this is usually where you would be making a mistake, because most of us understand the argument well enough. Most of us know how to read English well enough. Most of us can connect the dots. We're intelligent people, or you wouldn't be trying for GMAT, right? But this place is where we start to err because of preconceived notions or because we're just short of time, whatever reason. So this is what you want to focus most on if this is not a problem, right? Finally, evaluating the extent to which a factor can or needs to be influenced. When I say can, we can't change facts, right? If something is stated as a fact, which we'll spot here, we can't change that. So this can becomes very important. These are where traps come from. Needs to be, this is the distinguishing factor between the toughest of options, right? You'll find option B and C both talking about a factor that does matter. How do I choose between these two? They both seem relevant. That's where we need this. So this flow of steps from here to here to here is essentially the level of your question. The easiest questions you would be done with as soon as you understand the stem and can identify some factors. You're good, right? That's half your questions. The next 50%, so that's 75% done, let's say, you would need some level of expertise in spotting the factors. You would need to be good at that. And then the toughest of questions will just give you the right factors, even if you've understood the stem well, but you have to find those tiny differences that just affect the magnitude. And that's it. If you can get this much right, you're getting about all CR questions right. Yeah. Now let's go deeper into each of these, right? The first of this would be understanding the argument. Let's see. Now, when we're trying to understand an argument, the first stage is being able to distinguish between what we can question and what we cannot question. So questionable, not questionable, right? Not questionable essentially being facts. And questionable being conclusions, suggestions, predictions, anything, right? Now, this is what you would find most of the argument to be made of. If an argument contains 4 sentences, let's say, expect 3 to be facts, usually, right? You might have 2 facts, but usually not more than that. Because this is what the argument is built on. The facts are going to give you a conclusion, and there are going to be certain assumptions in the middle. That's the structure of an argument, right? You will have certain facts that lead to the conclusion if you make certain assumptions, and these assumptions are usually quite logical. Yeah. Now, how do we spot facts? They're just simple statements. They won't have anything qualifying in them. Tarun is a boy. It's a simple statement, nothing qualifying. But if I say Tarun is probably a boy, now that's a little weird, right? It's questionable. Yeah. That is what conclusions look like. That is what questionable sentences look like. We first want to separate them because this is how we know where we can build an option, where we can't build an option. This is how we spot what the assumptions are. Yeah? So that's first. Then we have identifying the key factor in every statement as much as possible. So let's quickly just go back to our stem to be able to do this. Give me 1 second. Right. So in this, if I read the first sentence, right, plantings of cotton bioengineered to produce its own insecticide against bollworms, a major cause of crop failure, sustained little bollworm damage until this year. So what is the key factor here in this sentence? If I was to ask you that question, what would you say is the key factor here? Is it cotton? Is it plantings of cotton? Is it the bioengineering? Is it bollworms? None of those. The key factor is the damage that was sustained this year. and it's saying the damage this year was next to none, or very little, which tells me that this bioengineering was successful. And that is why I know that this is contradictory. So I want to be able to spot the most important fact, and that usually comes from understanding what comes next. It can't just come from here. You will read this, a lot of factors will seem important, but as you keep moving forward, you have to keep spotting what matters, what does not matter. These connections or contradictions will do that for you. Now, usually the factors would be the subject, right? The verb or the object. Or it could be all three combined together. The plantings sustained little damage. That's the key factor here. Now, once I've done this, right, now I want to connect all of this together. That's the next step. Once I can know what's a fact, what's a conclusion, and I can identify the key factor, this means I'm processing all the sentences possible. Then I want to use these two to build a logic bridge. Connect them together. What goes together? What is questionable? What is contradictory? What's helping my conclusion? Where are the assumptions coming from, right? That is us building a logic bridge. The facts come from here. The conclusion also comes from here. Being able to spot the factors is how I break these facts down and how I break the conclusion down. And at this point, I have to come up with the assumptions as well. Yeah? Once I do this, my argument is done. Yeah? Post this, we have to move into the options. Now, what do we do with the options? We'll get into that in a minute. Let's just practice that thing with this stem. Plantings of cotton bioengineered. We've already talked about this sentence. We know that the key factor here is that the damage was very low. This year, the plantings are being seriously damaged by bollworms. Now, what is the key factor here? The serious damage caused by bollworms this year. That is what tells me that if I call this F1 and if I call this F2, I know that F1 and F2 are contradictory. They're pulling in different directions, right? This is my way of building a logic bridge. You can use your own way to visualize it, right? Bollworms, however, are not necessarily developing resistance to the cotton's insecticide. Now, again, what's the main factor here? The resistance. And the argument is saying that they're not developing resistance. So, if there was a possible explanation for this paradox, let's call that F3, then F3 just takes away this explanation and says that resistance is not the reason. Bollworms breed on corn, and last year more corn than usual was planted throughout cotton growing regions. What is the factor here? The volume of corn. More corn than usual was planted. That's the main factor here. Now I have F4, and what does F4 try to do? It tries to justify these two. Has to, because that is where the conclusion has to lead. But it doesn't directly, right? If I was to give you these two statements and just say that we planted a lot of corn, that doesn't work. It only works if a lot of corn actually led to a lot of bollworms. And that is where my assumption comes in. Because somewhere in the middle, we have to assume that a lot of corn led to a lot of bollworms. Just because we have a lot of food available does not mean we'll have a lot of population, right? It's logical, but it's not certain. That's why it's an assumption. So it is likely that cotton is simply being overwhelmed by corn-bred bollworms. Now, I just want to point out something here. If when you read this sentence, right? When you read this sentence, if the argument was not clear to you already, if you hadn't predicted what the argument was, if you couldn't predict the last sentence, right when you read this, then you have a weakness with logical connections. My job is to be honest here. And how do you build these logical connections? We'll talk about that right at the end. I will give you a plan per se, but it's essentially what we just did. You have to look at arguments, simple arguments, and see where the assumptions are being made. See how logic could connect. Try to predict it a little bit. Start with simple, move to tougher. That's essentially how you do it. But it's at least good to know that this might be a weakness. And this takes a lot of time to develop in a specialized plan. Alright, now we know our stem, right? This is the logic bridge of our stem. Now we got to deal with the options. How do we go about doing that? Again, the options have a 4-step plan. First, you want to identify the core factor that the option plays on, just as we did with every sentence in STEM. You want to repeat that with the options as well. Now, for evaluate, so from here it's evaluate specific. So far, everything we've done would apply to all CR questions. From here, it's about evaluate specifically. So within evaluate questions, if we just quickly go back to or go ahead to our options, you'll notice that we have all the options as questions. This wouldn't always be the case, maybe 99% of the time. There are certain exceptions. But evaluate usually has questions, right? And questions have answers. That's the very nature. So what we want to do with evaluate is we want to come up with extreme answers. Let's say I have a question that starts with whether. There are only two possible answers, right? Yes or no. But if I have a question, let's say what is the length of the bridge to be constructed? Let's say this is the question. Then this could have a very wide range of answers. I want to pick two extremes. I want to pick a very large bridge and I want to pick a very small bridge. These are two extremes, right? And I want to see how the argument fares at each of these extremes. That's how an evaluate question works. The extreme answers to have extremely different effects on the argument. That's how you evaluate an argument. If I'm looking to invest in a company, if I like the company for everything it does, and then I want to ask one question that can evaluate it, the question could be, does the company have a lot of debt? That is relevant. A lot of debt is usually a sign of a bad investment, right? A sign of a poorly performing company. Could be exceptions again, right? On the other hand, if I ask, does the company have offices abroad? That's irrelevant to my investment decision, right? It doesn't need to have offices abroad to evaluate, except, of course, in specific cases. But for all general companies, I'm okay. If it has an office in Kolkata, I'm good with it. If it has an office in Mumbai, I'm good with it. If it has an office in Shanghai, I'm good with it. Why does that matter, right? Unless in specific cases, sure. But in general, it doesn't matter. Very irrelevant. So extreme answers, right? Yes or no would be the extreme answers. Here, the extreme answers would be very large, very small. Here, the extreme answers would again be yes or no. I want to find the extreme answers and I want to see what the argument does or how the argument behaves for each of these extreme answers. For example, if I'm talking about this particular option, option A, whether corn could be bioengineered to produce the insecticide, if I have the answer as yes, but the problem is I know that the answer to this question is yes, don't I? The first sentence told me that. We did bioengineer it and it did work with the bollworms. So when I go to pick the answer no, I know that this option won't work. I can't do that. I cannot question a fact. Remember the can or needs to be influenced with the options? This can't be influenced. B we've already discussed. Let's look at the extremes though. If I take the answer to be yes, other plants are suffering as well, which means bollworm population must be high, justifies my assumption, strengthens it. But if I take the answer to be no, then the same plant, cotton, in its different form, the non-genetically modified form, is not being affected by bollworms, which means there must be something wrong with the genetically modified corn, not with the population of bollworms. So it weakens. It goes against my assumption. And this is an option that evaluates my argument. Looking at C, whether other crops that have been bioengineered to produce an insecticide successfully resist the pests against which the insecticide was to protect them. If we take the answer to be yes, I can say that it weakens my argument. If someone here thought about it weakening the argument, good job, you are thinking critically, that is good. The problem though is that when I take the answer to be no, it doesn't strengthen. So it's not really evaluating, right? One is not enough, it has to be both ends with evaluate questions. If this was a weakening question, for example, and we were to work with this, this would have borderline worked. This would borderline have weakened if anyone had picked this option. But with evaluate, since the no doesn't work, it won't work. D. Again, plantings of bioengineered cotton are frequently damaged by insect pests other than bollworms, but we know for a fact that we have been talking about only bollworms on Vidar, which caused by them. So if I take the answer to be yes, or if I take the answer to be no, this can't affect my conclusion either way. Because this is, the factor in itself is faulty. The factor here, the possibility, probably could work, but it has been taken care of in the option. The factor here obviously works because it's our answer. The factor here, again, could have worked, but not with this particular extent. So the extent to which it can be influenced does not work in its favor. The factor is just completely misplaced. And now with the weather insecticides that can be used against bollworms that have developed resistance. But now the factor here is insecticides, but which type? The ones that can be used against bollworms that have resistance. But the question tells us they have not developed a resistance. So now this is again talking about a factor that is not relevant to us, and we can eliminate this as well. Whether I take the answer to be yes or I take the answer to be no, it won't affect, right? Because the factor is irrelevant. And that tells me that our answer has to be B, the only one that does both things here. Now if this was a really, really difficult question, we would have multiple options that could have done this. For example, C would be better placed, and then we would have to go into the extent, but thankfully not. Right, so let's look at another question, right? And once again, take 2 minutes, try solving, and then I'll go into it, right? Go ahead, pause the video. Okay. Pardon me. I hope that you found the right answer again. Let's go through this question. I know it's an evaluate question. Let's read the stem, separate facts from conclusion, build a logical bridge. Metal rings recently excavated from somewhere in the western part of Mexico were made using the same metallurgical techniques as those used by someone else, Ecuadorian artisans, before and during that period. Factual. I cannot find one word here that lets me question whether it's completely true or not, which means I have to assume that it's perfectly true. And what is it saying? The key factor here are the techniques. The techniques used by the people in the western part of Mexico and the people in Ecuador was very similar. These techniques were used to build these metal rings. That's the crux of the first statement. Reading ahead. These techniques are sufficiently complex, to make their independent development in both areas unlikely. So this tells me that, not a fact, but the argument doesn't agree with it at least. So these techniques are complex, and it seems unlikely that they would have developed it individually, right, in two different places. To develop the same technique at a similar time is unlikely. Not a fact, and these two, F1 and let's say I would call this F2 here, factor 2 here, these two are not really leading us anywhere yet, but they are creating a sort of paradox, right? These two together are creating a paradox for me, saying that they are very similar, but they shouldn't have developed it individually. So what really happened? That's the question. Since the people of these two areas were in cultural contact, archaeologists hypothesized that the metallurgical techniques used to make the rings found in Mexico were learned by these artisans from Ecuadorian counterparts. Now we know they were in contact, that's a fact. Very important to spot this mid-factor 3, because this mid-factor 3, when taken in conjunction with these two, right, this is what leads us to our conclusion, which is that the Mexicans learned it from the Ecuadorians. And that's my logical bridge. Fact 1 and fact 2 create a paradox. Fact 3 gets me to the assumption that finally takes me to the conclusion, right? And this is the conclusion. Yeah. In short, Mexicans and Ecuadorians use a similar technique to develop metal rings. These techniques are complex, so unlikely that they would have developed it individually. But they were in cultural contact, so most likely Ecuadorians passed it on to Mexicans. Why do we think Ecuadorians passed it on to Mexicans and not the other way around? It's because of the timeline. So these questions should arise when you're thinking of assumptions. Why did we assume Ecuadorians passed it to Mexicans, right? We have a timeline. We know that Ecuadorian artisans were using it before that period. So that question, that assumption has been answered. Another assumption that we could have made here, for example, go for it, pause the video if you want, think about possible assumptions. That's how we develop what are called logical connections, right? Pause the video if you need, think about it. Right, I hope that you've come up with a bunch of them. But let's say, for example, here a possible assumption could be that a third culture did not teach it to both of them. That's possible. It doesn't have to be the Mexicans taught the Ecuadorians taught the Mexicans. It could be that the Filipinos came there and visited both of them and taught it to them. Let's say the Egyptians did. Just Just an example that just sort of puts everything in place, opens up the paradigm a little bit so that we can think freely. Now done. Looking at the options. All of the options are weather found, so it's going to be yes or no. Where the metal objects were traded from Ecuador to Western Mexico during the 7th century. Now what is the key factor here? The trade of metal objects. Let's say the answer is yes. Let's think. If metal objects were in fact traded between the two countries, what could it do? It could justify the presence of metal rings in Mexico. That's one. It could explain how we found them there. Then it doesn't have to be that the Mexicans necessarily made those metal rings themselves. It could just be that they traded it for something else from Ecuadorians, and that's a different reason. So when I take it to be yes, it does weaken my argument. And if I take it to be no, there was no trade, then I have no other explanation for the presence of these metal rings, right? Which means Mexicans must have made it, which means they must have learned that from someone, because Ecuadorians did it before them, should have been the Ecuadorians. It at least takes away one very strong way to weaken it, and that's what it strengthens. This is a very important question, and I would definitely want to keep the option alive. Not choose it as my answer yet, just keep it alive for sure. Where the travel between Western Mexico and Ecuador in the 7th century would have been primarily by land or by sea. So what is the key factor here? The mode of travel, right? Did they use land or sea? But does that matter? Whatever they used, they could have taught each other, or at least the Ecuadorians could have taught the Mexicans these metallurgical techniques. So whether I take the answer to be yes or no, because the factor is irrelevant, B can't be the answer. Whether artisans from Western Mexico could have learned complex metallurgical techniques from their Ecuadorian counterparts without actually leaving Western Mexico. Now this here, the key factor is, could they have learned it without leaving? So did they need to physically be present? Once again, why is it so that these artisans had to leave Mexico? Why couldn't it be the Ecuadorians came to Mexico? It could have been the other way around, right? I don't have to go somewhere to learn something. It's possible that the other person comes to me, even if we forget all the education that we have today. It's not necessary that one goes to the other way is also possible. So whether I take it to be yes or no, it again would not either give me another reason or weaken this present one. It just tries to answer a question about how the learning could have happened, not about if the learning happened, right? D. Where the metal tools were used in the 7th century settlements in Western Mexico. Well, we know metal rings existed. So again, this is talking about the existence. The fact here is the existence of metal tools, but we know they existed. So I can't take no as an answer, and obviously I can't question facts. So D will be out. Whether any of the techniques used in the manufacture of metal rings found in Western Mexico are still practiced among artisans in Ecuador today. So now here the factor would be the current use of these techniques, right? But we're only concerned with how they learned it, not whether they continue to use it. So the factor again would be completely irrelevant. I don't even need to get into the yes or no, and that gives me A as my answer. That's it. Now this is a good question, at least for option A. It takes some thinking. So even if you did not get to A being a good option right at the beginning, and you went through all the options and thought, hey, nothing works, that's when you go a layer deeper and think, right? You don't settle for an option. The option should be like a light bulb switching on. The moment the logic hits you, it should be, oh yes, that makes sense. It shouldn't be, yeah, that could make sense, right? So strike that difference, at least in critical reasoning. That might work in the tense direction. Now, the key things we've learned here, right? I would like to take you back to probably the most important slide of this session, the two most important slides. If you're not good at understanding the argument and being able to identify factors within it, which are sort of synonymous, then it doesn't matter how good you are at logical thinking. You will not be able to use that critical thinking because you won't know the data to work with, right? A program can be really efficient, really quick. But if it does not have the right input, it's never going to give the right output. That's not possible. So this is stage one. You have to become good at this. You have to be good at reading and quick at reading that too. Be able to spot little details. Once you do that, then your natural talent or what you build with time can start playing in. And well, if you're one of those lucky ones who can really think, then you will be able to solve the best of CR questions. But this should not be the focus. This is maybe 1-2 questions in the paper if you're getting a 740, 760. So this is not something that you're really focusing on unless you're already above 700 plus consistently, or 720 plus in fact consistently. If you're good at these three, you're good. Forget about those odd questions, right? You have to be selective. Now the second important slide is obviously this. This is particularly for evaluate, where you have to be good at being able to find the two extreme values. This is part of the first one already, but you have to be able to find the extreme values, and then again this is the logical thinking that we've already talked about. So this would be what you would learn separately just for evaluate questions. And with these two takeaways, right, as long as you practice these, you should be able to get better at evaluate, right? And now I do have a plan for it. Now I would highly recommend that you get a study partner, simply because they help you think outside the box, your normal range, and that's what we're doing with critical reasoning, right? And now if you don't have a study partner, you could get a tutor. If you find a good tutor, that's probably the best case scenario. But if neither works, you can just go to GMAT Club. They both have a very, very good question directory, probably the best collection of questions out there. At the same time, you can also get experts to answer any questions that you may have, or get study partners, right? So it's the cure-all, just in case nothing else works. Now, once you have all of this in place, this is a 4-day plan. The first day, we're going to be working on just building the first 2 steps of critical reasoning. I'm going to attach the presentation to the video so you can look at the presentation as well. The first 2 steps were basically understanding the stem, right? And that's what the first day is all about. And you want to do that with easy questions so that you build your confidence, you see your errors. And at least 50 questions, because again, we want to develop an instinct, not just know how it's done. There's a difference between mastery and just knowing how it works. Day 2, we're going to do the same thing for tougher steps now, tougher questions now. Because the first 2 steps are it all. Third is mostly talent and fourth is purely talent, right? The first 2 steps are what matter most. So again, the second day we're going to repeat the same thing. You'll do this with tougher questions this time, and if you want to go ahead and solve the questions, go ahead and solve the questions. I wouldn't recommend that yet, because that is not the point here. The point here is to be able to think better, to be able to spot assumptions, and that will help you with all types of CR questions, not just this. So think about that as well. Day 3, we can start with the questions now. You'll again start with easy questions, because again, we want to build our confidence, we want to see our mistakes. And on day 4, we're finally going to the tougher questions. We're going to find our level, and that's it. That's evaluate for you. We're just splitting it into these steps, right? First 2 steps in the first 2 days, and then 3 and 4 would be, again, steps 3 and 4. Try this, give it 3 or 4 days, see if it helps you. I hope it does, and if you have any questions, I'm always here. You can just connect with me on many of these social media platforms, or drop a comment on the video, that would probably be best. And share with your friends as well. I would want to reach as many people as possible for all the reasons out there, right? And if you have any suggestions, again, reach out. I'm here. I'd like to get better as well. So that's it from my side.